an online world full of muscle cars and hot rods like no other, with a bustling active supply and demand economy. If you have no idea what I'm describing, well, you came to the right place. Motor City Online wasn't known by many, but for those that did know it, it was loved and remembered for the brief time it was live. The company who developed the game alongside publisher EA was also behind the popular early 2000 racing series Need for Speed. Well, all but the original just about, including the very popular Need for Speed, High Stakes, and Hot Pursuit. EA Seattle would go on to launch Motor City Online October 31st, 2001, but after just a mere 2 years, the game would be shut down alongside the company behind it. What happened? Why did Motor City Online, a unique one-of-a-kind online racing RPG, fail to stay alive and even keep EA Seattle alive? We will uncover that and more while progressing through a timeline of events pre- and post-production of the game, while filing away any clues and pieces of evidence that we can use for our final deduction at the very end of the video. Pick one of the 60 cars, customize it with over 2,000 components, and then race it on over 24 different tracks in this death of a game, Motor City Online. The story begins with the little-known at the time video game studio Manley & Associates. Before their tenure and major success at EA Seattle, Manley & Associates was an even older video game developer founded back in 1982. After a desire to produce more ambitious games, they would be acquired by EA in 1996 to help with publishing especially, reportedly. EA Seattle would strike success after landing the very popular newly minted driving game, the Need for Speed series. After making various sequels, EA Seattle would create Need for Speed High Stakes in March of 1999. Need for Speed High Stakes would reach some good success, being scored an 86 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic, and being quite loved and enjoyed for the game's graphic fidelity, the depth of the game, and the soundtrack. The reason I'm specifically honing in on High Stakes is because, well, it's going to become relevant later on to the story of Motor City Online. That's because it's going to serve as the base bones, if you will, for what EA Seattle would then take and attempt to create an online title with. But before it was known as Motor City Online, it was actually known as Need for Speed Motor City. This can be seen in early promotional material, as in January of 2000. EA Seattle was referring to their newly announced online racing game as Need for Speed Motor City. The name would imply some sort of affiliation to motor cars or muscle-like cars, but in the Need for Speed universe. But for whatever reason, perhaps a lack of streetcar focus, EA Seattle would rebrand the game and it would go on to be known further as pre- and post-production Motor City Online, or MCO. EA Seattle taking the base mechanics from an already successful racing game and launching an online variant of it was actually smart. They already had a basis to build on and one that people already knew was proper quality. And it's not totally unlike early online RPGs, which were oftentimes single-player game adaptations. Now known as Motor City Online, the game would launch October 31st, 2001. Motor City Online would cost a full box price and a $10 monthly charge to pay for online updates and the capabilities. Motor City Online at launch would dwarf many single-player games in terms of sheer options and customization, which was pretty impressive. For starters, there were over 60 muscle and hot rod style vehicles that you could customize with over 2,000 semi-realistic components and race on over 24 tracks. And with the bones of Need for Speed High Stakes, the racing is quite quality, even in the modern times. It has realistic shifting combined with a realistic presentation and a customization system. Although Motor City Online was absolutely chock full of things to do for a standard racing game, there was a higher standard being placed on it due to it being a multiplayer racing title. On aggregate review website Metacritic, the game would only garner a 73 out of 100 from 12 different critical reviews. I think Motor City Online was worthy of being rated higher personally, but the various reviews done would detail why the game, despite being fun and a positive experience for some, was not being seen as a great game. Sometimes being one of a kind is also kind of a bad thing. Motor City Online was a racing game, but it was an online racing game, but it also had a supply and demand auction house, kind of like a MMO or something, where you could buy components and even new vehicles. Borrowing from classic online RPGs, MCO would also allow you to grind and garner money until you could buy better and more powerful vehicles. Here's how it works. There are 4 major classes of races: street, circuit, time trials, and drag races. In any of them, you can choose an open race where you can drive your own car, a sponsored race where you choose from predetermined selections of common vehicles, or club race against another team, both driving your own cars. At the time, and still largely to date, no other racing game had even attempted such a thing, where racing wasn't the only activity and the only way to make money now. You could also go to places like Roxy's Diner and Roadkill Cafe, though you could pretty much only use these places as chat rooms. GameSpot would score the title a 7.6 out of 10, stating that the poor cluttered UI, non-intuitive gameplay scheme, and latency issues and hit-or-miss economy mechanics would keep the game from being a great racing game. Although GameSpot would acknowledge a reboot bug and a few other not-so-working aspects of MCO, they would score the game an impressive 88 out of 100, stating that overall MCO was a very stable and fun, massive multiplayer online game. Now, all of this being said, the game was requiring a $10 monthly fee on top of this. So this was going to make the reviews harder to take at full value, like I always talk about with MMOs just in general. Would the outlets and players still feel the same after a few months of plays and a few months of those monthly charges? Would they keep having that same desire to want to play the game as feverishly as they were at launch? Well, critics were split on Motor City Online, but what did players think of the game? And what was good and memorable about MCO besides just some of its systems? Well, Motor City Online had really good base driving mechanics and sheer just options. The issues with the game come from the fact that it's felt and played as a multiplayer online racing game. Type of game that kind of didn't really even exist at the time. MCO, as I've mentioned before, wasn't quite a full MMO, but it was pretty close to it. It had an auction house, economy, friends list, and clans. And though the world was limited to just racing tracks and chat rooms, there was a world in a sense. There was even 4 different servers to choose from. So while nothing was massive, it was online and persistent and had long-term progression, qualifying as an MMORPG or at least an online RPG. These parts were exciting and unique, especially for the time, but they were also driving friction into the player base and making the game harder to enjoy for core racing fans. While MMO and online RPG fans are quite used to grinding for long hours to be able to get a new piece of armor or weapon, and maybe even doing non-combat or main gameplay things in order to raise those funds, well, racing fans expect to race the majority of the game to make money, and to play the majority of the game by racing. And they expect the unlocks to come much quicker and specialized for their specific cars. Motor City Online attempting this real supply and demand economy for the car components was cool and impressive, but it was also problematic because it was making the game more focused on the economy than the actual racing. That's because you could make money from playing just the market. You didn't even have to race necessarily. And sure, you could make money from racing and challenges and stuff like that, but again, you could also make money by not racing. Street races are another form of race that I mentioned previously, which weren't always full of players, so they weren't really a reliable way to make money. On top of that, whenever players weren't able to join a street race, AIs would take their place, and it was an entry fee based game type, which meant that AI are essentially taking your money. Most players would just end up playing circuit races, which didn't need players to function, but they would only make you a meager amount of cash. Drag races were supposed to be the equalizer to all of this, but without many restrictions in them, well, it's kind of hard to know what kind of cars you're going to be up against, right? And who you could potentially lose cash to. Some of the higher-end cars like the Cobra, the GTO, or the Mustang would range from 200,000 to 2 million. In a typical online RPG, this isn't really unheard of. In fact, I know of players that were able to have millions while playing MCO. But for racing game players testing out an online RPG world, critics and players alike were going to be harsh about this because they just had no familiarity with it. To make matters worse, there were latency issues where sometimes it would seem like someone would win, and then suddenly it would turn out that they wouldn't. So simply put, MCO was a quality game, but it was a hard-to-access one with a few pointy edges. Nothing fixes or an overhaul couldn't solve, however. There was enough there to work with, in my opinion. But EA wouldn't give the game very long to grow or work on any of these issues. Just 1 year later, there were major news that the studio behind the game, EA Seattle, would be shut down, and transferring only about a third of their studio team to the Vancouver studio of EA. According to the EA spokesman, a large reason for the shutdown was the size of Manley & Associates. They were the smallest of the newly acquired companies, and they wanted to consolidate their studios and developers more. This was done right after the release of another racing game for the studio, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, which according to EA's logic was fair because it was at the end of development and they were providing severance packages. But just like that, the studio behind Motor City Online and many other racing games was gone. One of the earlier victims to Electronic Arts, and not the last. Motor City Online would close August 30th, 2003, reportedly for EA to focus on their other online game for the time, The Sims Online, which would have its own rocky history and only last a few more years after. Motor City Online being shuttered so quickly was tragic, as it never got the proper life cycle or even chance for one in the first place. But when the company themselves was shuttered, it was always going to be a hard prospect to keep the game alive. Unless MCO was just crushing it, they were always going to be the first in the crosshairs, especially because it was technically a new IP, whereas the Sims game, well, gave EA most of their popularity besides the sports games, which is unfortunate, but an obvious decision for the suits and those at EA. Although MC didn't live in the last 2 years of live status, it was able to garner a cult following during the time it was online. So much so that the players were able to get their hands on an offline version of Motor City Online, because apparently it existed as a debug mode within the game all along. MCO might be playable in some fashion, which is more than many other dead games on this series can say, but not being able to play the game online is a shame when the core of it was very much built for that. And not just in the way of the online multiplayer, but the economy and how the unlocks work to a large degree, including how you made money, which meant that playing it offline wasn't going to give you access to that. But even then, you can still certainly feel and see the quality of the game. Even LGR covered the game more recently and showcased the quality therein. MCO feels like even in 2023, a good quality classic and, well, forgotten Need for Speed game. Which is either something to say about Hot Pursuit or MCO in general having that level of longevity even though it didn't last very long. Classic racing games are really good, and that's not a surprise for many racing game fans, including those watching. But MCO was a completely unknown classic racing game for most, including one that was based pretty much only online, which was unheard of at the time. It's hard to deny that MCO would likely lead to the inspiration for many more online racing games that would come like The Crew, Need for Speed World, and more. It was unknown to the public eye for many years, but the developers were well aware of the pioneer status that the game held. I do this for a living, sure, but I also do it because I have a personal obligation to try and tell as many stories about online games as I can because, well, I kind of owe them my life. Whichever kind of story that ends up being, big or small, as long as it's an interesting case, I'm going to cover it. And I haven't seen another game like Motor City Online, especially for how early it came out, and it deserves its pioneer status, and its story told. The detective music is playing, which means that we have obtained enough clues and evidence to solve the case at hand. Why did Motor City Online die so quickly? No player avatar. You're kinda just playing as a car that you choose from. Little community aspects besides trading in the social rooms. Electronic Arts pulled the plug for Sims Online. It was expensive. It required market play versus racing. The parent company was shuttered. MCO was ahead of its time. I hope you detectives have enjoyed this trip down memory lane, or for most, a completely new story about a little-known online racing game I felt worth mentioning. And I welcome the comments because yes, this does open up the door to cover other racing online games like The Crew and Need for Speed World, and more. Tell me which ones in the comments. And then stay tuned for more online racing games or more games to make their way onto the Death of a Game series. For now though, we have to go. And I need to catch a slice of pizza. Thanks for watching.